Yeah, you can start if you want. Yeah, that's great.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fifth session, which is about disease and daily inequalities. And I am Peilin Zhou from Harbin Institute of Technology at Shenzhen. And it's very honored to chair this session. And so for this session, we have 1 hour and we have 3 presenters. The first presenter is Tololopi Olseyomi, and his topic is about structural determinants of non-communicable disease in the global south, a critical geographic analysis. And our second presenter is Perlin Simin Chiu, and the topic is, if I pick up something, the muscle contracts in my boob, not my back, exploring the everyday geographies of living with, through, and on from breast cancer. And the third presenter will be, I think, our third presenter will be Mohammed Hossein Jeremy, right? And the third topic will be about the COVID-19 and the next neglected disease. May I have to notice and remind everyone that the whole process, the whole presentation will be recorded. So please, for each presenters, we'll have 10 to 15 minutes to present. So during the presentation, please turn on your mic and maybe turn on the video. And for the audience, please mute your mic and your video during the presentations. And after that, each topic will have 5 minutes Q&A. So if you feel comfortable, please feel free to just pop on the video, or feel free to leave your message in our chat bar. Okay, so I will leave the time to our first presenter, Tolupi Oseyomi. So could you maybe unmute your mic and your video?
Sure.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tolu Oshayomi from Department of Geography, University of Ibadan, Nigeria. I hope you can see my slides.
Yeah, we can see them, yeah.
Oh, great. All right, so I'll just start right away. What I'm about to present to you is an extract from my PhD thesis, which I defended 4 years ago. The title of the presentation is Structural Determinants of Non-Communicable Diseases in the Global South, a Critical Geographic Analysis. 10 years ago, the United Nations described non-communicable diseases to be one
Seems to be a problem.
I'm sorry about that.
No, all right.
The hazard of virtual existence.
Yeah.
All right, I will just share my screen again.
Yeah, no problem, yeah. Yeah, we're back on.
All right.
Looks of it.
Great. Thank you. All right. So as I was saying, the World Health Organization also, the statistics show that they account for 15 million deaths within the age group, the 30 to 69 age group. And 85% of that, of the 15 million deaths, occur in low and middle income countries, which are often thought to be primarily affected by infectious diseases. And in this case, you would then say that there's a double burden of health problems here. The WHO has come up with 4 typologies of non-communicable diseases, which I'm sure many of us know. The cardiovascular diseases, cancer, chronic respiratory diseases, diabetes, and also the modifiable risk factors as follows: tobacco use, physical inactivity, harmful use of alcohol, overweight, obesity, and unhealthy diets. Now, who is to blame for the increasing prevalence of non-communicable diseases? Now, the discourse on non-communicable diseases has been very, very emphatic on individual lifestyles as a risk factor. And that individualized frame has, to a very large extent, influenced how the policy circle or the policy environment responds to NCDs. And the limitation with that is it's reductionist and also very restrictive. And if it's restrictive, it also gives a limited perspective on what the causes of NCDs are. So therefore, there have been several calls for a structural or political economy perspective to the study of NCDs. And that has come up in recent times. Now, the argument for this is that shifting the blame from the individual to the economy will provide new insights to these causes. As a matter of fact, someone or some scholars did say that, and I quote, political economy factors are integral to the problems of NCDs and therefore must be integral to the policy responses. Situating NCDs within the socio-economic and political context. The rise within that discourse has been attributed to significant changes, all right, in the social and economic environment. And from the review of the literature, there are 2 main schools of thought with respect to the socio-economic and political context of NCDs. The first is that NCDs are a consequence of development, of economic development. That is, they've emerged as a result of the social and economic changes that accompany development. And the other is that NCDs are poverty driven. Okay? They are as a result of poverty. And you would see that there is a clash of perspectives because for a very long time, we've seen that diseases NCDs were originally termed as diseases of affluence, which I would discuss much later. So the first school of thought, as I mentioned, NCDs as a consequence of development. This largely derives from the Omran 1971 epidemiological transition theory. And the prevalence increases. Okay? In his own view, the prevalence of non-communicable diseases increases with the level of economic well-being and also industrialization. So the more developed the society becomes, the higher the incidence or the prevalence of non-communicable diseases. And of course, that takes us back to the original term, appellation given to them, known as the diseases of affluence. On the other hand, the NCDs are poverty-driven. That's the school of thought. The canon of this school of thought is that they are no longer the scourge of the rich, if I were to quote these 2 distinguished scholars. And the progressive shift from infectious diseases to NCDs in the global south are actually poverty-driven. It's driven by poverty, not by development. Okay? And looking at the relationship between NCDs and poverty more closely, you will see that there is a reciprocal relationship. That is, poverty increases the exposure to NCDs, and at the same time, NCDs also entrenches households in poverty. So in the attempt to care and also control, you will see that it's financially draining and it substantially reduces household income, and also income which would have been used to meet other household needs. So from the review of the literature, these are my knowledge, the knowledge gaps I derived. It's possible that the large-scale determinants of NCDs in high income countries may differ from those of low, medium income countries. And that might explain why Ruby et al. 2016 advised that one shouldn't classify all developing countries together and recognize economic and epidemiological diversity. So if I were to slightly modify that piece of advice, I would say that it's possible that we shouldn't actually classify lump high income countries and low medium countries together. And at the same time too, it's possible that there might be some variation from one low income country, medium income country to another. So the question really is, are NCDs a problem of development or a burden of poverty in the global south? Now, so the thrust of this study really is to see the need for a critical geographic analysis on the geography and also the large-scale determinants of NCDs in this country. So I decided to use diabetes mellitus, looking at the relationship between NCDs, using diabetes mellitus as a case study and development in Oyo State, Nigeria. And the need for this actually was because we needed to look at it at the local level to see if it would have a clearer picture. And this is the study context. It's a state, one of the 36 states that make up Nigeria. And within this state, there are 33 local government areas. And the mainstay of this state is the economy of Oyo State is agriculture and is well known for the cultivation of numerous food and cash crops. And that is its relative location within the country. The data are heavily relied on secondary data. Diabetes data was obtained from 8 institutions at the time, which at the time had diabetes registries, and ethical approval was obtained from my university. Development indicators too were also extracted from published government data sources. So a development index was developed for each of the local governments areas using the principal component analysis, and also to determine the nature and the strength of the relationship among these variables. Conceptualizing development, the study actually heavily rested on development as a distributive justice. So saying that development is said to be achieved when the basic needs of the society are met. Now to the results. These are the results now. You would see that there is a high level of incidence of diabetes mellitus in the what we call the Ibadan region. And Ibadan, as I must point out to you, is the state capital of Oyo State. So you would see that there is a high concentration of diabetes cases in that urban area or in that city. And you find that as you move northwards, you would see that the incidence declines. And that is, you would see that there's also that urban-rural divide too in the prevalence of incidence. And here you have the spatial pattern of poverty. You would see that it's higher northwards and also westwards, and also in the rural areas. Disparity, there are also disparities we're seeing in the level of development. Again, by the virtue of the fact that it's an urban area, or it's the capital city of Oyo State, Ibadan again was found to be the most developed areas. All right, and also northwards, you would see that the level of development also reduced. Now, the question arises that do areas with high levels of development have more NCD cases or more diabetes mellitus cases? And from the results, we see that there was actually, I'm sorry, there's a mix-up here, but there was actually a strong and also positive relationship between development and diabetes mellitus. And if you look at the coefficient of determination, you will see that it accounts for nearly 50% of the variation in NCD prevalence. And you would see that there is a negative and also an insignificant relationship between poverty and NCDs. Now, what are the possible explanations? So we can see that there is a spatial match between the level of NCDs and development. And what are the pathways? So there are a number of pathways through which development could influence NCDs. So number one is urbanization and the food environment. Africa or sub-Saharan Africa has been seen to be the least urbanized, but it has the highest urban growth. And these current levels are actually creating an NCD promoting environment through the unhealthy dietary choices, high level of physical inactivity, and sedentary occupations. And also the food environment too. It's the shift from infectious diseases to is also closely followed by a nutrition transition too. You also see there is a shift from traditional diets to the highly refined diets too. And there's this increasing demand for processed food because of the little or no time for homemade meals. And then also to the proliferation of fast food outlets too is also complicating the situation. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you, Tololopi. So it's very interesting topic, and I really enjoy your presentation. So it's now for Q&A. If there's anyone who have questions for Tolu. Actually, I have one. Oh, so yeah, are you on to have questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I was busy typing it out, but then maybe it's just better if I just ask it. So thank you so much for that presentation. First of all, it was really interesting. I work more on communicable diseases, so waterborne diseases mostly, but what you said about the individualistic framing of NCDs and how that influences policy responses more towards behavior change as opposed to the structural change that is needed, that really, really resonates. So I was wondering if maybe you could say a bit more on that point about whether you think the sort of behavior change interventions and the responsibility being shifted onto individuals is like a necessary interim to try and address NCDs before the larger structural changes can be realized, or do you think it's actually distracting attention away from the kind of policy that is necessary to get those structural changes? If that's too long-winded, I can try and rephrase.
Yes, I got you. All right. Do you want me to respond now?
Yeah, unless you want me to clarify more.
No. I got you quite right. Yes, well, my simple response to your question would be that, yes, the individualized framing is just a necessary but not a sufficient cause. So it would also be nice to see what other perspectives have to offer, how much light they would shed on the causes of NCDs or any other, or maybe communicable diseases as well too. But it would be very insular to just say that this would be the best approach, but it would be very lovely to have a multiplicity of perspectives which could enrich our responses towards behavioral change and also provide an effective policy response to public health problems. I hope I've been able to answer your question.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. It's really interesting. I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, there is another question on the chat board. It said, if a lack of access to medical care in poor or more rural areas and therefore diagnosis of DM could play a role in the discrepancy of rates of DM between urban and rural areas. So rates of DM could be more similar than they appear in official counter data.
Yeah, I agree with you, Rachel, because at the time I carried out the study, there were only 8 institutions in the whole state that had diabetes registry. So it's, in other words, not every health institution had the capacity to diagnose diabetes mellitus. Things might have improved now, but I'm very sure that's one of the limitations. One of the limitations of my study actually, and it's very possible actually that it would have been underreported or yeah. So I quite agree with you.
Okay, thank you, Tolu, and thank you very much for all the comments for Tolu's presentation. I do have a personal question, but I will just send it advice. I won't abuse my chair's power. So thank you very much, Tolu. And now, shall we move on to our second presentation from Pearlie Seeming Tell about exploring the everyday geographies of living with, through, and on from breast cancer. Okay, maybe. Okay, and Tolu, could you please end sharing your screen? Okay, thank you.
I think you might have to unmute yourself.
Okay. Yes.
Okay.
So hi, today we'll be looking at the to explore the everyday geographies of living with, through, and on from breast cancer. This research is part of my PhD, and it's will hopefully formulate an empirical chapter for me. Just a few content warnings. There will be mentions about body image, grief, loss, and death. So please look after yourself emotionally. So thinking about the literature surrounding this research, one of the key things is to look at illness instead of disease. So illness is the qualitative and lived experience of a disease, so not the medical aspects or the treatment, but rather looking at the effects on the body that the disease might have, and looking at the how it impacts social relationships and its implications on meaning making and identity. This research also draws upon Mage's ontological commitment towards living dying geographies that looks into the continual and perceptual process of dissolution and generation that our bodies have. So thinking about, in terms of breast cancer, it's not something that is clearly defined of life and death, but rather in a relational way where the cells are not either invasion from outside, but rather from the inside, and that to achieve a longer lifespan, you have to kill parts of your body that are you. Research also draws upon post-phenomenology's attention towards the specific affective phenomenality that emerges through encounters with other bodies, non-human, and the world. In particular, the emphasis on not judging engagements and encounters with medical interventions, technology, etc., such as treatment in this case, but instead focusing on this specific affective phenomenality that occurs from these encounters. This includes looking at the vitality of embodied experiences and dynamism of felt intensities, and can range from high-level anxiety to low-level harms of hypervigilance, which we'll explore later. As well, we look at how bodies become disabled through everyday geographies and how these occur through relational becomings. This research also draws upon Frank 2013's understanding of life with cancer as a form of foreground, where the foreground and background of sickness and health constantly shades into each other. So instead of a static picture on a page where light is separated from the dark, the image is more like a computer graphic where one shape is constantly in the process of becoming the other. So this form of becoming, change, and emergence is what the research will be looking at. So the data is collected through qualitative semi-structured interviews, 28 of them, through platforms such as Zoom, Skype, FaceTime, and participants are recruited through social media, online support groups, and snowballing methods. So one of the key things that came up from the research is the refusal to use cancer, to use war metaphors surrounding cancer, the cancer experience. Our propensity to jump to metaphorical thinking, such as war metaphors or better metaphors, is a testament to our desire to create order in times of chaos. And while this can be really useful for some women, as it gives an idea of control and agency, it can also expect women to become the main caretakers of their bodies and places a form of regulation on the body as a way to make sure that you are the obedient fighter that is best ready for a battle like cancer. So these war metaphors can neglect the helplessness and lack of agency that an individual can have during breast cancer, during their body's engagement with breast cancer. So J3 talks about how using words like fighting cancer or being in the battle implies that if you lose, it's your fault. And that illusion of blame is created, and it does not address the realities of breast cancer, which is that the medicine is what is driving the recovery, and it doesn't actually matter how positive or how good of a fighter you are. Such blame narratives can often position the patients as being the one who failed the treatment instead of treatment failing the patients. And these engagements with medical interventions mixed with the whole fear and anxiety that you don't fit into the mold of a good fighter if you're too tired or you're too scared, and as we can see in this quote, can lead to heightened levels of fear and a specific affective phenomenality that can feel like sped up dying. And so in this chapter or research presentation, we'll be deviating from these war metaphors and to focus on the everyday geographies. So one of the things that occurred amongst lots of my participants was the changes in their taste buds post-treatment, and specifically after chemotherapy. So Anne talks about how, before this, she talks about how alcohol is really challenging because of the way it makes her feel. So that tipsy feeling you get when you've had a few drinks and you're in that floaty zone kind of thing, that's something that's very similar to what she experienced during her chemotherapy, and something she's very keen to avoid. The taste of alcohol as well leaves a similar taste to what you get after chemotherapy, a little bit of a metallic flavor that you can't really get rid of. And so this means that for her, it's very going to pubs, for example, is a bit more challenging because she doesn't want to stay as long, or she's a lot more tired as a result of the side effects that have lasted way beyond her treatment. She shares with me how her friends were brilliant when she was ill, but when she has to go home earlier or can't drink as much anymore, she goes from being more of a party pooper to becoming the party pooper. So it shows how being with others can have limitations. While her friends who were there throughout all her very challenging times were able to be with her and show her the empathy she required after her treatment, because she had no evidence of disease anymore, they were unable to provide the support that she needed. So in this instance, places non-human, which is the alcohol and its interactions with our bodies, as well as spaces around her, the embodied memories and her bodies and her friends' bodies coalesce to form an affective phenomenality of frustration and otherness. However, these affective configurations can shift and emerge differently with age and time. And she later on shares about how where it used to be a reminder of the stark difference that she is from her friends, it is now a reinforcement of personal boundaries, and it allows her to be more aware and more attuned and more respectful of her body's new capacities. And that form of self-assurance and a relationship with the body and its confidence required time to become. If she didn't go through the treatment, she might not have the years to be able to do any of the looking backwards. So there is a value in seeing the freshness in the making, as difference for her is clearly emergent through different temporalities and allows for meaning making through different times and different selves. These everyday geographies that occur with engagements with breast cancer can be extremely mundane as well in very unexpected ways. So Em talks about how even something as simple as rolling over in bed a bit too quickly can have its own challenges. For her, it feels like her skin's going to tear and her body's tearing apart because of the way the reconstruction has altered her body's literal geographies, and that strangeness is something that she has to deal with. She also goes on to share how the challenges pervade into everyday life in very different ways. So for her, because chemotherapy is effectively a poison, there are lasting damages. And for her, it is the cognitive abilities that are impaired that affect her the most, because she could be in front of somebody important trying to share an idea, and a word which suddenly disappears. So chemo brain as a side effect is something that's often talked about by my participants and actually occurs during our interviews. And that challenge can be filled with frustration and shows how the shading of health and illness can very often be really subtle and quick in spaces where we least expect or least hope for it to occur. And to Em, after treatment, it kind of feels like you're a puddle of sludge on the floor, and you have to somehow find your way back to being a human being again. And that uncertainty of finding your way back to being a human is a huge part of the experience of living through and living on from breast cancer. And it is evident in her everyday small mundane bits that constantly remind her of her engagement with that disease. Similarly, the geographies in which these bodies occur in are important as well. J5 talks about how every day you put in your prosthetics, you have to think about it, not just about the mastectomy, but also how your life has changed. So different geographies create different experiences, and specifically she shares how engagement with fabric, materiality, and gravity can be quite interesting. So certain geographies bring out specific fears and concerns. In the pool, she shares with me how the first time she went swimming, her prosthetics floated and she lost it down the pool, and she had to swim and get it, and it was a very embarrassing encounter for her. So the buoyant force pushing up against gravity has created floating breast issues, and lots of awkward social encounters. Gravity on land is also an issue as well. So the breast that was not operated on, she breastfed her children with that breast, and the gravity of being on land meant that it wouldn't match what was with her prosthetic. So even though it was a similar weight, it was never the same, and that created a sense of never feeling right in her own body while she's in the bra, and that's especially prominent when she's in a strapless bra as well. Even something as simple as wearing a t-shirt is challenging, because t-shirts are often thin, and when the atmospheric temperatures change, the breast with a nipple on would become erect from its engagement with the temperature, but the other side, which is the prosthesis side, will be completely flat and smooth. And so that difference emerges as a result of the body's engagement with different geographies, but also atmospheric elements as well that are completely out of her control. So that unevenness was something that occurred to her, and it showcases how the dynamism of these felt intensities and how it is significant for her, because these differences are in very different invisible ways. They are not categorical, but are resultant from a specific relational emergence of difference. Movement can also cause a creation of new geographies and spaces of becoming. So as talks about how for her reconstruction, they had to open her up, cut across the skin, take the muscle and the skin is attached to from the back and put it under the armpit on to where the breast would be. And effectively for her, this was important because it meant that she's got living skin. Living skin is something she prizes a lot because she didn't want anything foreign in her. However, this procedure has also meant that because of a slim figure, her skin is now directly on the bone. And so without the muscle in between, she cannot do things like hoovering, she cannot do a lot of other small things. And while we laugh about her husband doing it anyway, one of the biggest struggles she faced was wanting to do it, but not being able to do it. So difference here is emergent. Her disability is made evident in the simple act of hoovering, and it has implications on her relationship with her husband who's just trying to help. And so here we can see how bodies become disabled through everyday geographies and its relational emergence. Here's a diagram of what her procedure was like for her reconstruction. And that has its own issues as well. So for her, not feeling foreign was important. However, this procedure to keep living skin has meant that a different strangeness has occurred. So she shares with me how your brain thinks that the muscle is still behind you. So despite being 4 years into a surgery, if she picked up something, the muscle contracts in her boob, not her back. And that weirdness is something that it's really hard to describe, and it's very evident when she opens a door. So when she opens a door, the muscle that tenses is not her back but her breast, and that strangeness feels like it's pushing against the skin as well. And so this highlights the refusal of an experience to enter into the past, as Gross 1994 mentions. It illustrates the tenacity of a present that remains immutable. It also shows how time and space are clearly informed with each other and cannot be understood in isolation, specifically in this experience. And this emergence of difference is established through the body's relationship and engagement with the world and objects. So when we think about doors have their own materiality and physical characteristics. And this serves to produce its own agency that in turn conditions our body, or specifically her bodily engagement with them. So if you think about how many doors you open in a day, fire doors are a lot heavier. Some doors are just harder to maneuver. Those are very small, mundane, everyday things that somebody like us will have to think about. But also, when we think about a door is also a fairly ambiguous space. It is an in-between border crossing point, and that liminality can actually be quite symbolic to life living through, on, and with breast cancer, because it is uncertain because you don't know which muscle you're going to use until you're using it, and your breast is tensing instead of your back. These changes in the body can mean that hypervigilance is an occurrence. So thinking of hypervigilance as a low-level effect, and how the entanglements of the body, embodied memory, but also its projected bodily capacities to cause cancer or pain again, can generate effective modulations of anxiety and vigilance that run in the background. This resonates throughout life with breast cancer and fall through every aspect. Every ache, pain, and bodily shift becomes a cause of concern. However, it's not always negative. Sometimes it's necessary, as you can see here. And while sometimes it's good to be vigilant, other times it can just be debilitating. This can lead to shrinking social spaces because nobody actually wants to hear about the experience, and where community becomes extremely valuable as a result. This means that relationships with others who have this form of solidarity can be extremely significant. For T, the social, digital, and the entanglements of shared anxieties and fears coalesce into an effective phenomenality of moral support encased within a mobile phone, hence we're in your pocket. And this is a very specific form of being with that's really important. Other forms of being with include empathy that is not just about words or consolation. Sometimes it's a process of being with. So R talks about the shared space of sitting in the rain, and that enables becomings of connection and presence despite the absence of words or traditional means of interactions. These low intensities and hums of support vibrates in the silence and sits with and becomes with, and therefore enables being with. Unfortunately, with all living, dying geographies, there's always the dying aspect. And when you meet people that are of the support you require, who understand how you're going through, watching them go through the end of their lives can be incredibly challenging, as Jane has mentioned, and it can evoke things like survivor's guilt, feeling like you should you shouldn't be alive, because if they're not, why are you? And that risk and heartache is part of living life with breast cancer that is often least talked about but most challenging. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Erling. It's very impressive presentation of you. And now we have some time. Any questions for this presentation? Okay, I think we have one. Elizabeth says, I always love hearing about your research. I wonder if you could say a little more about living dying geographies. Yeah, that is also my curiosity.
So just idea of living dying geographies is the idea that life and death is not separate distinctions, but rather in a constant relational, it's relational basically. And especially when you think about certain processes like chemotherapy, it's a really interesting example, because in order to have more life, you have to allow the bits of you to die. And it's not just the cancer cells that die in the treatment, it's also your healthy cells as well. And with the living dying geographies, it understands that constant pull and push of everyday cellular death and rebirth constantly happening. And to use that frame to understand something like breast cancer, it's very helpful, because with breast cancer, with all of our bodies in general, we could be developing cancer cells as we speak, and we don't actually know they could be dying as well as we speak. And that process and paying attention to that relationality can be really useful to understand why a patient might be struggling so much with the hypervigilance like we talked about, but also in terms of their relationship with their body and how bodies are constantly changing anyway, and that living dying pays attention to that constant state of emergence. Hope I've answered that question.
Okay, thank you very much, Perlin. And I think because of the time, we have to move on to our last presentation. So thank you very much. So our third presenter, please forgive me, I apologize, will be
no problem.
Hosna
Yeah.
Singapore. Yeah, and she will talk about COVID-19 and the next neglected disease. Okay,
Yeah.
I'll leave it to you.
Hello everyone, thank you all for joining us. Please let me share my screen. In this lecture, I want to depict a new picture and introduce an odd account to the future of the current pandemic. I want to introduce you the next neglected disease, COVID-19. The problems of the privileged differ significantly from those of disadvantaged. Sorry, I have a problem. Sorry, I have problem.
No worries.
Okay. Okay, I think it's okay. Okay, I'm sorry again. I want to introduce you the next neglected disease, COVID-19. The problem of the privileged differs significantly from those of disadvantaged. Individuals in poor communities must fight mainly against contagious and communicable diseases, whereas those in developed societies might primarily combat lifestyle disorders. Many diseases in low-income nations are caused by poverty-related factors such as malnutrition, indoor air pollution, lack of access to appropriate sanitation, and health education. According to the World Health Organization, diseases linked to poverty account for 45% of disease burden in the world's poorest countries. The disease of poverty, such as malaria, tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS, and neglected tropical diseases, cause many problems on vulnerable population in poor countries, while many of these diseases are easily treatable. In fact, researchers argue that virtually all diseases prevalent in low-income countries are neglected. In the past, just like the COVID-19 epidemic, today's neglected diseases killed hundreds of individuals every day in the world. By gaining a better understanding of these diseases and obtaining efficient therapies, they have disappeared from developed societies, becoming the disease of poverty or neglected tropical diseases limited to the borders of developing countries. In 2019, 1 million people, about 4,000 cases per day, died from tuberculosis. With the 13 countries with the highest TB burden accounting for 87% of new TB infections. India, Indonesia, China, Philippines, Nigeria, Bangladesh, and South Africa account for 2/3 of the total. Moreover, it was estimated that over 400,000 people, about 1,100 cases per day, died from malaria in 2019. WHO African region was involved for a fairly large part of worldwide malaria burden. 94% of malaria cases and deaths was in these regions. As you can see in this chart, 1.1 million deaths of TB were from Africa and Southeast Asia. The COVID-19 pandemic, also known as the coronavirus pandemic, as all of us know, is an ongoing pandemic that is one of the world's leading causes of mortality. Rising COVID-19 cases, many uncertainties about COVID-19, and the danger of new variant of the virus make it abundantly clear that the broad vaccination is the only key to finish the pandemic. Consequently, various vaccines have been developed in rapid time by scientists using public and private financing. However, a significant divide exists between wealthy and poor countries. As a result of the vaccine's development, COVID-19, which was initially seen as a unifier, became a factor in widening the divide between developed countries and low-income communities. Vaccines are rapidly reaching developed nations, although the developing countries have limited access to coronavirus vaccines. Low-income nations receive less than 1% vaccine administration in the world. Many of people, including healthcare workers in these countries, have not yet received the first doses of the vaccine. To solve this vaccine inequality, WHO developed COVAX, a global vaccine access program with the goal of vaccinating about 30% of the world's population by the end of 2021. But COVAX distribute about just 40 million doses of vaccine to the 110 countries. Sanctions, economies, limited supply of vaccines, vaccine diplomacy, and inappropriate vaccine distribution were the main reason of COVAX failure. In reality, the world is divided into two sections. In a few months, it seems that the progress of vaccine would turn into the pandemic in developed countries. On one side, CDC has stated that vaccinated Americans can travel freely. UK health authorities announced recently that they are approaching the end of the pandemic due to the increased vaccine coverage. On the other hand, however, developing countries such as India, Iran, and Brazil have not yet reached their peak. Inequitable vaccine distribution is leaving untold millions of people vulnerable to the virus and turn COVID-19 into a neglected disease or disease of poverty in developing countries. Unless WHO chief said, unless we end the pandemic everywhere, we will not end it anywhere. Emerging the new neglected disease or disease of poverty would have several consequences for developed countries and also low-income countries. The first of all is the virus mutation and the emergence of new variants in unvaccinated regions. Many vaccines immune people against existing strains of the virus. Spreading the new variants force many countries, even vaccinated nations, to imply restricted public health measures like travel restrictions. Mutation will occur inside the body of, on the other hand, mutation will occur inside the body of the people in developing countries that make the situation worse in these regions. About prevention and treatment. During the pandemic, WHO and member countries will have many responsibilities, such as monitoring the evolution of pandemic, medical and non-medical recommendations, and update guidelines and public health measures to control disease around the world. Ending the pandemic leads the WHO to be released from the emergency situation, which has negative consequences for low-income nations that are still suffering from the disease. On the other hand, pharmaceutical companies don't stimulate to find drugs and cures for diseases related to poverty. The new drugs are very expensive, and it's not commercially profitable for the company to produce, for drug companies to produce new drugs for disease related to the poor countries. In this situation, the control and eradication of the neglected disease is impossible. Another consequences for developing countries is co-infections. Infections with other neglected diseases like TB and malaria can increase the mortality rate in developing nations, and that could be a disaster for these countries. And so about social stigma. Social stigma is the hidden effect of the disease limited to the borders of low-income countries that is not considered in measuring the disability-adjusted life years. The social stigma can affect the patient's quality of life and their social activities. And the last one is the economic effect. The neglected disease, as you know, have many economic burdens on the government, such as health services costs and reduction in employees' productivity. Governments experience severe financial losses because of the disease. Thank you all for your attention. My colleague, Dr. Jahromi, the co-author of this article, and I will answer the questions.
Thank you very much. Well, you touch a very important and interesting topic. You know, so during the pandemic. So we have some time for Q&A, and I wonder if there's anyone have questions or comments. Maybe I have, maybe it's not a question, but after listen to your presentation, it gives me a lot of worries about all these people in these different countries. And I wonder, have you seen any of the potential solutions or ways out from any of these countries?
I think developed countries should support the COVAX program and help equally distribution of the vaccine to all part of around the world. And I think it's the best solution. But some countries like Canada provide million extra doses of vaccines, Pfizer, for its country. But what about developing countries? You know, I think the COVAX is the best idea.
Yeah. Well, okay. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you very much, Hosna. And I don't want to stand between you and lunch, so maybe let me end this session first, and we will have plenty of time continue our discussion in the chat bar and during the lunch break. So let me thank all the presenters for your wonderful, impressive presentations. And also thank you for our participants and all the audience for coming to this session. And thank you for forgiving me that maybe I did not pronounce your names correctly, but I've tried my best. Okay, and please don't forget to vote for your best presentations for this session. And we will end it here, and I think we will have 1 hour and a half for lunch break, and then we will be back at 1 p.m.